Hi, so I am going to get started. We're waiting a bit to allow a few more folks to settle in, uh, but we're going to move forward soon to uh, be cognizant of the time of those who've gathered. And I'll do so by spending this moment doing introductions. My name is Eugene Scott. I'm a journalist. I'm an opinion writer for the Boston Globe and was previously a fellow at the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'll be moderating today's discussion. But before we begin, I just have a few brief announcements. So logistically, this discussion is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording afterwards. The video will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. And so we encourage your participation. You can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to keep an eye out for those. And we'll make sure there's ample time for audience questions. And our panelists will try their best to reply to some of those, even if we don't get to them in the discussion. So this event is part of the Ash Center for Democracy's 250 series, which convenes leading scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to examine the nation's democratic past, present, and future. Through public conversations, lectures, and panels, this series explores the ideas, institutions, and challenges that have shaped American democracy and the opportunities to strengthen it for the generations to come. So we're very grateful to the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, institute that I was also a fellow at, for co-sponsoring today's event. We're joined today by a distinguished panel. Lindsay Chervinsky is a presidential historian and executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. And Leah Wright is a historian. She's also a faculty member at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So with that, let's get the conversation started. So we have some questions that audience members submitted via registration. And so we're going to start with those. Again, feel free to send some of yours in as things come to mind. So let's start. I want to start with young people. I mean, we have college campuses here represented. And one thing I've been thinking about is how college students are processing this moment. And it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on what the next generation of voters are doing, or that you think is worthwhile or interesting or fascinating, and how they are commemorating the 250th anniversary of the country's founding.
So, Lindsay, do you want to go first, or I'm happy to go first? So first, just before I jump in, because I think thank you for these questions, I do want to thank the Ash Center and the SNF Agora Institute for sponsoring this event. And I also want to just point out a little bit about, I don't think the timing of this and the timing of us having this conversation couldn't be more apt. Last week, I think many of you may have seen that there were congressional hearings on the Trump administration's accusations about ideological, quote unquote, wokeness in America's museums and history organizations and archives. And the hearings were quite brutal, to say the least, as was the executive order that the president issued in 2025 about the museums and archives, but also the more recent statement that he issued specifically targeting Smithsonian institutions, especially the Museum of American History. And so I say all this to say that this is not simply I think, a conversation that is about America at 250 and what does that mean, but that there are political implications, widespread political and social implications to the idea of America at 250, and the idea of what role history and historians should play in this larger conversation, but also in how we imagine democracy and forward movement in our imagining of the past, right? So it's not just what history is not simply about the study of the past, but it's also about what are the implications for the present and the future. And I think we're seeing that play out in very real time right now. With that said, the other part of this, to answer your question, Eugene, is that young people, especially on college campuses, I've noticed an explosion in the number of students who want to have historical grounding. Now, that
Mhm.
doesn't always translate into an explosion in the number of history majors, right? Like students aren't necessarily running out to sign up to be history majors. There's still very much an emphasis across even liberal arts campuses in students saying, I'm going to be, I'm looking for a technical degree, something like that. But what I've noticed is, particularly in the classes around foundational issues, classes
Mhm.
around civics and instruction. I teach a class in Washington, D.C. It's the Hopkins in D.C. program that is on elections,
Mhm.
whether it be presidential elections or midterm elections. And just the interest in students participating in this and wanting to know the very basic and foundational aspects. And we're not just talking about the founding era, and I think Lindsay can weigh in on this as well, but or the Revolutionary era or things like that, although there's been an explosion in that as well. They want to know about like the French philosophers who are coming over and writing about the grounding and the foundation of the concepts of democracy, right? And I think part of it is that as we are watching the transformation in our constitutional republic, and as we are seeing things that we have been taught for our entire life, particularly through the instruction of civics, give way and give way quite easily. And we're seeing, first of first, right? Unprecedented. I think historians are tired of using that term, unprecedented times. But as we're seeing unprecedented things that we were told and that we were taught in our classrooms and that they were told and taught growing up, they want to know the mechanics, the nuts and bolts, how the sausage is made. And what they're learning and what they're finding is that actually they don't know very much. And so I've just been really energized by the number of students who have come in and elected to learn more about history, foundations, civic education, and then for the students who have also prioritized that. So we're seeing an explosion in the number of like voting organizations on college campuses, an increase in the number of civic education organizations, right? Democracy or open dialogue organizations on campus. And to me, that is a really, really positive development that reminds me that, not to be cliche, but the children are the future in this case.
Mhm. 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 I am helping lead Harvard Summer in Washington program, and about 100 undergrads from the college come to intern in DC all over the place. And one of the events that we had that was best attended with was a monuments tour, and it was great. We just rode around in a trolley all over DC, and as you know, these monuments, and this is distinct from like a museum, but monuments with all this history that tells you a lot about this country. The students were very hungry to learn because, to your point, you know, their foundation isn't always as strong as they would like it to be.
Well,
What if you? Yeah, I was
yeah,
going to
you
ask
guys
you.
probably have a
Yes.
little bit more experience with college students because I'm sort of dealing with either like the younger generation, sort of like the school groups that are coming to Mount Vernon, or I'm dealing with like maybe very sort of tail end college, perhaps starting into the graduate period. And what I'm seeing is a difference between people who have a memory of politics before, let's say, 2015, and people who don't. Because for the people who have a memory of politics, they're understanding that what they're seeing is different than what they lived before. And so there I'm getting a huge, like, why is this happening? What are the origins? What did it used to be like? Looking at the founding period, the 19th century, wanting to understand the evolution, wanting to understand sort of what sort of reforms would be possible based on that. For the younger generation, I'm seeing not apathy, which is great because actually apathy is the enemy. Displeasure or unhappiness is not the problem. It's when people stop caring, and that's really the problem. And so I'm delighted that a younger audience is not apathetic. what I'm seeing for them is that this is their normal. This is all they've known. And they also have a sense that it like is completely broken. And yet the founding feels quite different, feels quite irrelevant to them because it's so far, it's a bunch of dead white guys is the story they have been told, which of course it's not just a bunch of dead white guys, but that was the story they were told. It feels super far away. It feels irrelevant. And so what I've been trying to do in my work and what we've been trying to do is one, if you actually tell the full story of the revolution, it allows a lot of people to see themselves in that story. It allows them to see that maybe their ancestors were involved or even people like them. Like, let's say their family came to the United States a generation ago. So they're relatively recent immigrants. Well, immigrants played a huge role in the revolution. So, how do we center their story or at least include their story in the founding of the nation? But then the second piece is I think we have done a disservice in some ways by over glorifying the founding and by treating it as a thing that created this extraordinary thing. We've made it feel very immovable and
Mhm.
unchangeable. And in
Mhm.
reality, most of the founders, and this includes the multiple different generation of founders, were really just throwing spaghetti against the wall and trying to see what stuck. They were recognizing that they didn't have all the answers. They didn't have a game plan. They were trying a bunch of new stuff. They were reforming what worked and what didn't work. If there was a loophole, they tried to address it with an amendment. They crafted two constitutions in 1 decade. I mean, it was a period of tremendous innovation and reform, and they fully expected future generations to do the same. They expected that each generation of Americans would try and make the nation just a little bit more perfect. And most generations of Americans have picked up that challenge and run with it. Of course, the post-Civil War amendments are perhaps the best example of a generation of Americans saying, how can we make this nation more perfect? Recognizing that perfection is never fully attainable. But things like the 19th Amendment and the Civil Rights Movement, these are all attempts to take what was the foundation provided by the founding generation and move it forward. And it's only really since the Cold War that we've started to treat this experiment as a concrete, unchangeable thing. And that I think feels very distant to young people. Whereas if we say, no, it's actually up to you to figure out how to make the nation more perfect, that does give them a challenge and a call to action.
Indeed, indeed. Lindsay, I have found that when you help some individuals realize just how young some of the founders were, 18 and 21 and 25, not everyone was Benjamin Franklin. You realize
Yes.
you're less likely to treat these people as these wise sages who got
Mhm.
everything right and were
Mhm.
unworthy of critique and pushback.
I love that. I love that. We have in the reading room at the library, we have a bunch of busts that show how a bunch of them would have looked in 1785.
Sure.
And we select that year because that's the year of the Mount Vernon Compact when Maryland and Virginia signed the first interstate economic agreement and decided to issue the invitation to the states to come to Annapolis the following summer, which then,
Mhm.
of course, issued the invitation to the Constitutional Convention. And almost everyone guesses Benjamin Franklin because he's 78 and he looks
Sure.
like as they envision
Sure.
him. But in 1785, John Adams is much younger than sort of the presidential portrait than they're thinking of.
Yes.
James Madison is in his 30s. Alexander Hamilton is either 30 or 32, depending on which birth year he's going with at any given time.
Mhm.
And it's harder to recognize them when you're not thinking of them as these non-old gray dudes.
Indeed, indeed. Another question we have that I thought was really interesting is when was American democracy like most questioned? It's this moment. You both are historians. Is this moment where so many voters and lawmakers are grappling with what it means to be a democracy? Is this new? Are we facing a reckoning that we haven't seen before, or is this something that previous generations has grappled with? What does it mean to be a democracy? Was there a panel of democracy at 125 is what people are pretty much asking? America at 125?
I mean, so I'll definitely let Lindsay, because I can only imagine the kind of arguments that, during the Revolutionary War period or the immediate post-war period they're having about the question of democracy, right? But I think one of the one of the things I'd love to start out with is the most popular speech that from the 4th of July, which is Frederick Douglass's, what is the 4th of July to the slave or to the Negro, depending on the version that you get, which is all about the concept of, right, of democracy. What does it mean to have independence and freedom to somebody who is either enslaved or a formerly enslaved individual? And he delivers this speech, to a group, to an abolitionist group of women. And so there are levels of irony to this as well, right? Which is also women don't have the right to vote at the same time. And so they're really thinking about what is the question of freedom and independence and democracy. And so what I like to point to is, when 2016 happened and there were all of these kind of panels in the aftermath of Donald Trump being elected, and people saying, this is the end of democracy, is this the end of the guardrails, all of these kinds of things. And I was like, the guardrails have been off if you've been a certain part of demographic in this country for centuries. So the idea of democracy is one that has constantly been an idea, but it's never been democracy as envisioned, right? We have democracy in practice, and then we have democracy in envision. Democracy is bloody. Democracy is fraught. It is not static. It is not easy. It is something that is constantly being remade and redone, and it is something that has to be fought over. And so one of the things that I've really been taken by is Sean Wilentz in his book on democracy points out that democracy is at its brightest when people who are outside the scope of democracy force the nation to expand the boundaries of democracy. So to Lindsay's earlier point, when those people force the nation to become a more perfect union. So democracy is extremely bright when the Civil War amendments are passed. Democracy is extremely bright during the first waves of the post-war civil rights movement in the 1920s, in the 1930s through the 1960s. Democracy extremely bright during the passage of the 19th Amendment, and so on and so on and so on. And I think we can still see those things today, right? When marriage equality, when Supreme Court upholds marriage equality, right? That is a moment where we say, wow, we are actually making this country a better union. We are upholding the premise of democracy, or the radical experiments for the city shining on a hill. So I think that those are the points where we see it, while simultaneously realizing that the concept of democracy is something that we've fought over for generations.
Mm-hmm. This makes me think of the idea, the age-old debate that we see judges having about whether or not the Constitution is this living, breathing document, in terms of what is America, what can it be, and is that something that's ever changing or evolving?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I think there's some really interesting history that shows that the Constitution was understood as this very constantly changing, constantly evolving thing until about the Cold War, when we were not only fighting various military battles, but it was considered to be a conflict about good versus evil. And if we were good, then our system had to be inherently moral, to set up that juxtaposition, which meant that the system, the document that created our system, had to be perfect in order to sort of have this juxtaposition. And so that's when you start to see people saying, oh, no, it can't be touched because it's this perfect thing. And so that concept is actually really a relatively modern one. But the question of, who is an American? What does it mean to be an American? And will this system actually work? Was one that was incredibly difficult and contested from 1775. And I use that date intentionally because that's the date that Washington took over command of the Continental Army. And he sent out these general orders to the Army on July 4th, 1775. And he said, we are now the United Forces of the North American provinces. The United States hadn't been declared yet. And I urge you to set aside your regional differences for a united cause. So trying to figure out how to bring together all of these people, and they were ready to say that they were not British, but they were not yet ready to affirmatively say what they were. And that choice of being an American is such a complicated one. But there have been so many moments where there were real questions about whether or not the thing would actually work. So the election of 1800 and the transition has been, I think, kind of glossed over by really wonderful Jefferson propaganda about the revolution of 1800. But there were mobs outside the Capitol threatening to hang anyone who took the presidency from Jefferson. There were militias stationed on the borders of Pennsylvania and Virginia ready to march into the city if Congress couldn't come to a resolution in the election. And that type of constitutional question of can the Constitution actually provide a resolution to a problem was one that the 19th century time and time again. So 1800 is a great example of that. But during the War of 1812, Congress was largely absent. No one could find the Supreme Court, and it didn't really have a quorum anyway. And the president had largely just kind of shrunk from the duties. So, again, a constitutional question of do you have a government to actually function? And of course, the Civil War was a military answer to the question, to the constitutional question of can you secede from the nation? And those 4 years were a period where the answer was not yet clear. And so while I don't think we are in that place per se, although of course we don't want to get to that place, people always say, what decades remind you of this one? And I say the 1850s, but that's not great because we don't want what's coming next. But I do think that there have been moments when there were real questions about can the institutions or can the document answer the challenge that we are currently in? And the challenge we're currently in looks slightly different than 1800 or 1814 or 1861. But nonetheless, I think there are real questions about can we answer that challenge?
Indeed, indeed. And, I hope that encourages some people to know that this is not the only time or the first time things have been this difficult. And arguably, there have been times that were even more difficult, as both of you all have referenced. I've got a great question that says, how can we weave difficult memory and affirmation possibility? When Jesse Jackson died, I believe this past spring, I was watching clips of him speaking at the DNC. I can't remember if it was 84 or 88, but he had everyone on their feet as he was talking about, as he went from talking about issues of America to the hope of what America could be. And I think you both addressed that sometimes people who are maybe traditionally patriotic are a bit uncomfortable with some of the criticism that they see being lobbed at the country from younger generations or people who maybe believe differently than them politically. How can we figure out a way to speak about the country honestly and in its fullness, but while maintaining hope about what is even possible?
That's such a good question. And I do think that it is one that we are in the midst of, the country is really in the midst of an identity crisis around. But as Lindsay has pointed out, we've been in an identity crisis for a really long time. One thing I would encourage to people who are listening in today, to people who may listen into the future, is to go visit your national museums, monuments, and archives. Because I think one of the best things that has really come out of this country is the way that our institutions, our public institutions and our public federal institutions have documented and become timekeepers, essentially, storytellers, right? Based in evidence and fact around the nation's history. And so what we do, and what historians do, but what archivists do, what curators do in these museums, for these monuments, for these institutions, and again, I think, Lindsay, it would be wonderful to hear your perspective on this from someone who is the director of, a presidential center. What I think that they do really quite beautifully is they tell hard histories. They tell the unvarnished truth. They tell our stories. And there's been a lot of work to get to that point. But this is why we have the Museum of American History. This is why we have the Smithsonian. This is why we have the Museum of African American History and Culture. But the detractors say, well, you spend a lot of time talking about the negative. they don't pay any attention to the story of resilience that every single one of these museums and spaces tell, because that is part of the American story, right? So if you go into the Museum of the National Museum of Modern African American History and Culture, yes, you will find the story of slavery, but you'll also find the story of freedom, of independence, of success, right? There's a whole section devoted to Barack Obama and to Oprah Winfrey and to Jesse Jackson, right? And to the passage of all of these just really incredible um, civil rights and progressive legislation that's not just a story of, of Black people in America, but of America itself, right? So it's a story of all of us. The immigration story, right? The Museum of Immigration History, the Holocaust Museum. All of these stories tell just rich, robust narratives about what America is in the American project, the grand American project. And I have to say, I worked on a six-part series for America's 250th called This Land that was about America and the founding of America to the present day. And it's pretty dark stuff, right? Like as we're talking about war, seizing land, seizing property, right? Like settlers going across the nation, the trail of tealers, all of these things. The producers at the end say, "Are you still hopeful about America?" And I say, "How can you not be hopeful about America after hearing this story and hearing about how people have persevered, how they have managed to succeed in hostility and against all odds?" Right? Like to me, if we allow it to be, and this is what these museums and these institutions and these historical sites do, they tell that story. And so I think that's how you maintain, I think, a level of, you know, posterity, but also
Mhm,
uplift in these really conflicting times.
mhm, mhm,
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think I obviously am biased, but I think public history institutions are great places to look at this because they have to kind of meet people where they are. And you can't, at least for us, like we can't take too extreme a position either, in the case of George Washington, all good or all bad, because A, that's not true, but also because it would be off-putting to Americans that we're trying to bring in and we're trying to welcome. And so if we emphasize the full story, it gives space for people to be affirmed in some of the things they already feel that either Washington was capable of tremendous cruelty, or Washington did extraordinary things. But let's also introduce more to the story, and learning, of course, is the goal. For me, I think I have sort of two approaches. One is by shifting how we tell the founding story of one of innovation and experimentation rather than sort of like this genius that was handed down from high above the thing. By teaching it in an innovative way, what we're saying is changing or evolving or amending, therefore, their creation is not criticism. It's embodying that spirit. It is actually upholding the founding legacy of constantly trying new things. So it is a deeply patriotic message to say, how can we try and create a more perfect union? Because that was the charge handed down to us. And so I really try and present that as a deeply patriotic way of thinking about this story. The second piece is we really can't view human beings as Excel spreadsheets because we're not. And so you can't, no matter how much you try, you cannot balance, there are some people who are obviously evil, and there are people who are probably more fundamentally good than others, but most of us have light and dark in us. And so we have to share the full story. We have to tell the full story. And that is actually a much more useful story, because if deeply flawed people like George Washington or James Madison can still create and produce extraordinary things, then that means that we don't have to look for perfection today. Because if we did, we would be sorely disappointed by what we find. Instead, we can accept that there are deeply flawed people around us that are still capable of producing extraordinary things. So
mhm,
I actually think that embracing the flaws and telling the hard history, the difficult history, the painful history is essential to understanding that while, of course, the hard has evolved over time, and rightfully so, there's always going to be hard. And what we have to do is figure out how can we still thrive, as Leah said, how can we survive past that and go on to do extraordinary things despite our very human existence.
So, kind of related to those points, there's a question about the erosion of democracy at the hands of self-interest. And I'm not completely sure what the questioner was thinking, but when I read that, I couldn't help but to think about the spread of individualism in our country and how it shows up in, uh, you know, politics in terms of how people lead, but also how people vote, and how people move through, um, how they practice citizenship. Um, because it's not just about someone using their power to take advantage of a system. It's in how we treat our neighbor. That can erode democracy if you're prioritizing self-interest above all else. What are some of your thoughts on the role that like showing up primarily as an individual and how that navigates what it means to be an American, what effect that has on the health of a democracy?
So I'll start by saying I think that, one of the things that we talk about within the American creed, or the founding principle of Americans, is there's an overwhelming, emphasis on the individual and individualism. And for those of you who are interested, take a look at Ayn Rand, where she talks a lot about individualism and the individual and the benefits of the individual to the society. What I actually think has happened over the course of really the last half century plus is that we have taken the idea of individualism to its extreme, and we've actually lost what the true meaning of quote unquote rugged individualism was. That in fact, rugged individualism coexisted with a robust collectivism that supported the citizenry and is the very foundation of American democracy through one many, right? And I think that there are many communities throughout the American nation that haven't lost this sense of collectivism. And we can actually see this in voting patterns, for example, right? So for those of you who are interested in kind of the nuts and bolts and the granulars of voting patterns, there are a number of groups and demographics that consistently vote not out of singular focus or single issue or because of themselves, but because of what they think of in terms of the community, right? I'll even say this. One of the most interesting things that has come out over the past court to me over the past 20 years, the collectivism thing used to be something that was really relegated to racial minorities and to women across racial groups. But over the course of really like the last 20, 25 years, we've increasingly seen that like white college educated men, white non-college educated men are casting votes. And when they talk about the votes that they cast, they talk about future generations. So they say, I'm not casting this vote because of myself. I'm casting it because of my son, or I'm casting it because of my grandchild, and because I have anxiety about their success, even though they may still be successful, right? They may still be making 6+ figures. They may still be living in segregated areas, right? The best, wealthiest areas in the country. But the kind of anxiety they have about the social transformation of their children, particularly around issues of drugs and social mobility, is one that is translating into a new kind of collective identity. Whatever the case, to I think the larger point, your larger point, Eugene, collectivism and a collective sense of identity is the underlying strength of this country and of democracy. And I think moving forward, one of the things that we have to do is that increasingly our government has placed emphasis on individualism and has really moralized. I don't have I don't have a better way to say this, but has moralized selfishness as a good thing,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
One of the things that I write about in a separate book project is how in the 1980s, being poor became seen as a moral failure, And so
Okay.
the emphasis was on the individual failure. Being rich, being greedy was seen as a moral good, right? I'm going to be greedy for myself, for my family, for you. And so the emphasis is on the individual to do whatever it takes because the moral spectrum has shifted. And so
Mhm.
what I think part of what we need to do, and this is coming from the government, not individuals on the ground, it's coming from the top. So I think part of what we need to do, including as part of our civic education, this broad project of civic education for the public, for the masses, is re-emphasizing the idea of collectivism, right? Through one many. If we all, if one of us succeeds, then we should all succeed. If one of us fails, then it's a failure on all of us.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think I think there's a sort of a misunderstanding about what individualism meant, especially in the 18th and early 19th centuries. That of course there was an importance about sort of individual liberty, but liberty was not absolute. Even for white men of property, there was an understanding that by going into society, this is, the exchange between sort of the anarchy of pure nature and society, that when you enter into a society, you are giving up certain individual liberties for the common good, for the understanding that everyone benefits in this collective. And as a result, it is worth sacrificing some personal liberties to have that common collective. And this was something that the founding generation understood very clearly, that they didn't think when they talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they're not talking about being independent as an individual to do whatever the heck you want whenever you want to do it. They have a very different conception of what personal liberty meant vis-a-vis the whole. And part of that, and I think what I see today, especially in terms of our kind of our political culture and then also our global culture, is this sense of service of what do you owe back to the
Mhm.
collective in
Mhm.
exchange for the safety and security of belonging to the collective. And, at the time in the 18th century and the 19th century, there was a sense that the best men had an obligation to serve. Now, obviously, that is deeply problematic because we understand that the best minds are not restricted to white men, and that should apply to a much more broad category. But today, I don't think there's any expectation really that some of our best intellects or our best entrepreneurs or any of those things would go into politics, because why would you? It's miserable. You have to put your life out, on the open. Your family is potentially at risk. There are a lot of other ways to be much more financially successful. And so we have an incentive structure that incentivizes people to go into service to either make money in a certain way or to get famous in a certain way. And
Mhm.
that is not, I think, an incentive structure that has benefited anyone. I also think there is a global dimension to this. There's amazing social science that demonstrates that when one democracy thrives, other democracies thrive. This is a
Mhm.
global existence. And the inverse is true too, that if one democracy is suffering, it's likely to make the others suffer. And that is because democracies tend to be better allies with one another. They're less likely
Mhm.
to go to war. And then so therefore they're more likely to form associations or alliances and either sort of thrive or fail together. And we've lost a lot of that. There's a really pernicious individualism when it comes to the nation, I think, that is undermining so much of the collective work that was done in the post World War II order, where the United States basically got to dictate foreign policy for the Western world. And we benefited enormously from that collectivism. We benefited enormously from having allies. And so I think we have a kind of corrosive individualism locally, nationally, and internationally.
So, Lindsay, that's a great way to go into this question. One was that was submitted that says, "Do you believe that the U.S. is still an example of democracy worldwide? Do you think other democracies and countries that aren't democracies, but with a strong cohort of people aspiring for their nation to become one, look up to the U.S. as an example right now?"
Well, I'm going to give sort of a multifaceted answer, which is that I think that our foundational principles, which I see as articulated in the Declaration of Independence and then given life in the Constitution, albeit imperfectly, um, have been an inspiration to nations for centuries. So many different generations of revolutions have quoted and repeated their own version of the Declaration of Independence. So that continues to be an inspiration.
Mhm.
I also think that other democracies desperately want the United States to be a strong democracy. They desperately want us to be a model for them to aspire to because it is better for them and it is better for the world when we are acting with our democratic principles at the forefront. There is, I can't remember the name of it, but there's the case study or the assessment of where democracies are, and we
Mhm.
have fallen out of the ranks of the liberal democracies. So obviously there are significant problems in our institutions and our norms and our culture and our I would say the laws surrounding our democracy that are not upholding those high standards. And I do think it is deeply concerning to other democracies, but I also think that they desperately want us to be in a healthy place, and they understand that it is good for them when we are in a healthy place.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I'll just jump in here and say to Lindsay's point, we have the United States has dropped precipitously on the democracy index, the global democracy index. We're
Thank
now,
you. That's what it was.
yeah,
Mhm.
we're now considered democracy is endangered within the United States. And I think that that should be a wake-up call for all of us. I do think that authoritarianism is on the rise globally, that this is not just a US specific, or right, we can't be US essentialism or exceptionalism in this moment, exceptionally like, but it's part of a larger grouping or a larger pattern of shifting world changes that these global countries, including the US, that has seen itself as a leader on democracy for so many years, that we are just completely unprepared for.
Another question I thought is really great. I would love to hear you all's answer. A guest asked, what could be other locations to anchor American democracy besides the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, and its founding fathers? I would love to hear from you all. My first go-to is the Civil Rights Movement. But it would be great to see what you all think of other periods in American history that make you think of these are core moments when it comes to shaping American democracy.
I would actually toss in, I think, voting more broadly. And voting has always been kind of this really interesting um, idea, because voting is, you get these, I think, purists who are like, well, voting is not in the Constitution per se as a guaranteed right, like, and you're like, well, actually, it is, right? Like, it is a protected right, even if that word vote is not in there the way that we want it to be. But I think the passage of the 19th Amendment and then the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act,
Mhm.
and the extension of the Voting Rights Act, and then the subsequent kind of gutting of the Voting Rights Act, which
Mhm.
has happened over the course of the last 20 years, right? Like Shelby v. Holder, and then the more recent decisions on Voting Rights Act, which has eroded some of those things, and the kind of stagnation of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in Congress right now. These are things through which we can trace really this idea of democracy, because the practice of voting is perhaps our purest form of democratic participation or civic engagement, right? That we can think of. One person, one vote, theoretically. So we could also toss in, if we wanted to, the idea of the Electoral College, which has become this quite contested, right, space. But beyond thinking of it as a controversial, contested space, the actual history of the Electoral College is one that we can center around ideas of democracy, like how did it come to be, what did it mean, that kind of thing. Um, One other area, so Eugene, I love the idea of like the civil rights movement, and I certainly would expand it to be, what are the other movements, the other
Mhm.
civil rights and civil liberties movements that branch off from the civil rights movement. So thinking about, the LGBTQ plus,
Mhm.
immigration rights, labor rights, right?
Women's
That,
rights. Yep.
so maybe expanding it to include civil liberties. But then I think too about um, the concept of, I think, slavery, of slavery, labor, and freedom in this country. Because I think if we reframe some of the conversations about things that we have, whether it be being in a capitalist society, democracy, voting, right, active civic participation, civil rights, much of it comes back to pre-founding ideas of how this country is built and for whom and who gets to participate and why. And so the reason I say not just thinking about it in slavery and labor, I'm also interested in thinking about it in terms of class. So you have slavery as an idea, but then you also have these different class statuses, right, including the agricultural class, poor indentured servants, right, working class destitute citizens within this country who don't have the same privileges as the planter class or the settler class, right? That kind of thing. So really thinking about how do we change the dynamics to think about this as a story of freedom and enslavement and class and labor.
I would add, I think if we look at moments when there have been reform, Leah has mentioned a bunch of them, but I think the progressive era also offers us some really interesting examples. And I'm kind of putting that loosely 1890s to 1910s. And I think it offers us a couple of concrete examples in a few ways. One, it wasn't through one party. The concept of various different types of reform were very grassroots, things like child safety laws, or labor restrictions, food safety, environmental protection, housing conditions in cities. And what they were able to do with this grassroots reform is inspire a progressive platform in both parties. Now that looked different, depending on in the 1912 election, you had three progressive candidates. You had Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson that all proclaimed that they were progressives for different ways. And in some ways, I think we're seeing a little bit of this today. You can refer to it as sort of the horseshoe method, where sort of the wings of different parties come together on certain issues. For example, the Maha movement sort of brought together people from the far right and the far left. But you also see it on things like banning stock trading in Congress. That is a bipartisan issue that has unbelievable support in both parties. Or term limits for Supreme Court justices. These are issues that are not necessarily one party or the other. And so there, I think the progressive movement offers a lot of really instructive examples for how you need to sort of gin up the type of support, outcry, public mobilization. And then ideally, you can get a figure. In some cases, it was Theodore Roosevelt. In others, it was other politicians that kind of see the value of that movement that already exists and decide that they are going to kind of glom onto it and are able to push it over the finish line. So I think that's a very instructive moment for us here. It also reminds us that democracy is not just Congress or the presidency or the courts. It's not just voting. There's so much. I really think citizen should be a verb in that there's so many ways to participate in civic society. There's, civic organizations, there's participation in your community. There's so many ways that one can engage in a democracy, and the progressive era movements, many of them often started with small local organizations, for example, in Chicago to try and provide better living conditions for immigrants or education for immigrant women. I mean, there's so many small niche things that you can take and run with. So I find that movement to be particularly interesting, especially because many of the political conditions of the 1890s to 1910s, things like the shifting voter demographics for the parties, huge wealth discrepancy between the robber barons and sort of the average person. There's a lot that's similar to today. And so therefore it is, I think, an interesting parallel.
So that kind of speaks to a question that we just got online that you two may have addressed, but if you didn't, if you feel like you didn't and you want to be more clear, I would love for you to. And the person says, it's encouraging to hear about college students' interest in civics, but what can be done to further educate non-college folks who make up the bulk of folks who see no problem with what is currently happening? And I do think, I mean, as someone who covers identity politics, I think a big mistake we often make when we talk about young people is assuming that most young people are college students. And there are just so many people that need to be reached in our society outside of these institutions. How can we get them more civically engaged?
So one area to start is to meet them where they are. And I think, one of the big pushes for civic education is how are people ingesting their civic education? I think I saw a comment either in the pre-submitted questions or online that mentioned something about should we be concerned that the majority of people are getting their news from online sources? And on the one hand, yes, we should be concerned. But on the other hand, how do you meet people where they are, right? This is actually how a number, I think, of innovations have happened over the course of the 20th, really, as we're thinking about like the 20th century, which is finding the technological advances to meet people where they are. So if people are consuming all of their information from the internet, right, in this really deeply dominant way, then the answer is not to abolish the internet. The answer is how do we get into those spaces and create things that people will engage with? And, right, and there's a lot of science and like scholarly studies to back this up, engage them in a way that won't alienate them, that won't push them away, right? One of the best ways that you can do that is by presenting the material to them in a way that really walks them through the material. Because if you present it in a way that is accusatory, is inflammatory, is angry, or is, judgmental, people actually double down. They're like, don't want to adjust it, don't want to take it, I'm going away. So if you are coming up with online advertising or online, seminars, that's like you're really dumb because you get all your information online and you know nothing about civics, what do you think is going to happen from that? You're going to lose your target audience, as opposed to having these kind of conversations. And I've seen a lot of organizations that have started to do this, both through mega influencers or micro influencers. So micro influencer would be an influencer who has like under 250,000 followers. Um, and having these deep dive conversations in partnership with established organizations. So it might look like, the Smithsonian partnering with an influencer who has 300,000 followers to have an open conversation about civic education in 2026, right? Or it might look like Lindsay partnering with, I'm making this up, Kim Kardashian, to have a conversation about, actually, wait, Taylor Swift. We'll go with Taylor Swift. That's a little more palatable. But having a conversation about how how these things matter, right? How voting rights matter if you live in Tennessee, right? Something like that. And so I think part of it is what I think Eugene was highlighting, which is that everyone is not going to be on a college campus. Everyone's not going to have access to these spaces. Everyone's not going to want to have access to these spaces. But if you begin to meet people where they are, right, particularly given the technological advances in the present day, then you begin to speak a very different language and have a different conversation. And one point that I'll stop, and then I'll stop here, is in 2017, Dan Rogers, the historian Dan Rogers, wrote a piece in a magazine immediately following the election, a couple months after the election, where he said, as experts and as scholars, we need to start speaking different languages, because the languages that we are speaking to one another. We are speaking to privileged groups, and it is not having the effect of permeating the rest of the general public. So we have to find, particularly using technology, ways to speak to the broader public. And there are innumerable ways to do that in the current moment.
Indeed.
I could not agree more. And I think part of that also comes with us rethinking how we value sharing history work. So right now, in the history field and sort of the professional scholarly fields, there's sort of a hierarchy of scholarship, and there's, books and articles and journals and things like that. And people who regularly share work on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, that's kind of seen as like, well, that's less serious. And to be sure, it's not having the same sort of peer review as types of other scholarship, but it is essential to share this information in a way that someone that's not in a college classroom can find it. And there are a lot of ways to do that. There are, podcasts and social media and YouTube and local organizations. So I totally agree with Leah in every way that we really have to think creatively about meeting people where they are. I also think that we have to start viewing the organizations and the opportunities for gathering that exist in society as opportunities for this type of work. So there is no reason that we could not pressure, sports leagues, professional sports leagues, to include some of this information as part of like one of their like they do the giveaways or they do the various different themes for baseball games in particular. I'm thinking about that. Or like, why isn't the NFL doing a American history section? I mean, they did include that coin at the very start of, the Super Bowl kickoff. That was a replica of a coin that's in the Smithsonian, but there could be more. Similarly, like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, kids sports leagues, these are all places where you could, not that you want to like inundate children with this information, but there are lots of places where you can reach them to encourage them to engage with these ideas and to really feature civics as a part of our much broader culture and our family culture and our town culture in a way that is not just confined to a classroom. So I do think we need to kind of break out of the classroom mold and think about how we can fold that into a much part of our broader social life.
And one more
So
thing.
go ahead, sure.
Yeah, Eugene, I think this is just a plug for both the Ash Center and for SNF Agora. SNF Agora is in the process of launching a program that is very similar to this called SNF Agora in the World, where SNF Agora actually is going out into the community, right? As opposed to letting the community come to us. The design is to go out into everyday places, libraries, churches, youth organizations, what have you, and have these conversations about civics and civic education. And a couple of years ago, the Ash Center launched a similar program, I think with very good results. I say it's a few years ago, but I actually think it was now, looking back, it was 10 years ago. But but one of the things it was about public monuments. And so how do we have conversations with people in areas who are very resistant to replacing public monuments, like Confederate monuments? How about we go and meet these people where they are and we talk to them about their concerns and about what would work for them and ideas about history and community and dialogue. And it was incredibly effective. So I think this is just a wonderful idea, and I just want to like solidify that and also plug the two sponsoring organizations.
My final question was actually going to be to ask you all to plug some type of movie or book or documentary or podcast that people can consume and share with others that might be able to help them understand democracy historically and where things are going. Obviously, Leah, if there's more you want to plug, you can. But Lindsay, if there's something that comes to mind you want to share, please take the time to do so.
Oh my gosh, this is like the meanest question you can ask for historians when you ask for a recommendation. Like my mind goes blank or like comes up with 1,000 different options. Um, oh, okay. This is one that I think, in terms of understanding this is a little bit of an older podcast, but for some reason it's the first thing that came to mind. There was a podcast that was put out called Transition Lab, and it was about the history of presidential transitions and the creation of the peaceful transfer of power. And it was created by the Partnership for Public Service, which is the nonprofit arm that does the office and the briefing support for staff during presidential transitions. And it looks from sort of Washington to today and tells you the behind the scenes stories that maybe you don't know about, sort of thwarted terrorist attacks, personal vendettas, all the good stuff, but also why this part of our republic is so essential. So that would be one podcast that I would recommend.
Awesome.
I have one more recommendation. It is a Netflix documentary called America, Our Defining Hours, which is very much in the vein of like 250th, but I think that it's easily accessible. I think it's like a couple seasons, but it really is an in-depth kind of really behind the scenes of those moments of American history that have made us who we are today.
Oh, one more. Sorry, just we're gonna keep
No,
going.
please.
The American Experiment on Netflix is a 5 episode season. It came out in I think it was like July 1st, maybe, and it was produced by Tom Hanks. It has historians and scholars and public officials and everyone you can possibly imagine on all sides of the political spectrum. And it kind of just looks at the founding in a really complex way. So it is a good way to brush up on that history.
Great, great. Awesome. Well, I appreciate both of you all joining us today and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I hope people still interested in remaining in touch with you can go to the Ash Center page for this event. And there's contact information profile for all of us. And we hope to remain in touch. You all have a good day.
Thank you.